My name is Emily. I'm 45 years old, and I live in the suburbs of Denver with my husband Michael. On paper, I'm a full-time housewife. What few people know is that behind that quiet facade, I'm the CEO of a medical equipment distribution company that brings in millions of dollars in revenue each year. My salary is around $175,000 a year. But Michael has never had a clue. We met at a friend's gathering when I had just turned 30. Back then, Michael was a warm, attentive man with a charming way of speaking. He noticed every little detail, like how I held my coffee cup with my left hand, or the way my eyes lit up when my favorite song was mentioned. I used to think if I could spend my life with someone like that, it would be the greatest blessing. We got married after nearly a year of dating. At first, I truly believed I had chosen the right person. But that seemingly lasting happiness began to fade when Michael started showing his true self. He began making excuses not to change jobs. Even though his current salary barely covered basic expenses, when I gently offered suggestions, he brushed them off. Sometimes even saying, "Don't try to make me live by your standards. I'm not your employee." I tried to talk him into it many times. Even when my company had an opening in the administrative department, a role that only required basic communication skills and a professional attitude, the salary was more than double what Michael was making. I even personally spoke to the head of HR to hold the position for him. But when I brought it up, Michael frowned and said, "You think I'm so useless? I need my wife to get me a job. Don't meddle in my business." I was stunned. I couldn't understand how someone who once said he loved me so deeply could now take sincere advice as an insult. His stubbornness baffled me. But even after being shut down, I kept trying to endure. I thought, as long as I made enough money to keep life stable, everything would work out. Every month, I regularly deposited $1,800 into Michael's account as a living allowance. He would burn through it in less than 2 weeks, then text me complaints about food prices, gas prices, how life was stressful. I stayed silent, not because I didn't know he was spending the money on frivolous things like sneaker collections or online games, but because I was too exhausted to argue with my income. That amount wasn't significant. But what hurt me wasn't the money. It was his growing indifference. He never once asked if I was tired after a long day, never noticed when I stayed up late answering emails or had to fly to 2 different cities in 1 week. In Michael's eyes, I was just a woman living off the money he provided, and he was the one working hard to keep this home together. I remember one time my mother came over to help tidy the house while I was in online meetings all morning. As soon as Michael got home, he tossed his keys on the table and said something that made my mother freeze. "Another stranger in the house again. I need my peace and quiet." I stood up, took a deep breath, and spoke through clenched anger. "She's not a stranger. She came here to help us, not to be disrespected like that." Michael just shrugged. "That's how you see it, but not me. I have a right to feel uncomfortable in my own house." I turned away, hiding the tears that had started to fall. That was the first time I felt a crack in our marriage that couldn't be repaired. After that day, there was a strange silence between us. We still lived under the same roof, shared dinner, sometimes watched the same TV show, but everything felt cold and forced. No more random hugs, no more goodnight wishes, just 2 people living side by side. As if the bond between us had dried up and turned into routine. Michael became increasingly irritable. He'd get mad over little things like a towel not folded the way he liked, or the TV remote not in the right spot. He blamed me when the coffee machine broke, even though he was the last one to use it. It was as if I had become the scapegoat for every little frustration and disappointment in his life. Slowly, I started to feel like a maid in my own home, invisible, unappreciated, and utterly alone. One evening, I came home after a tense, grueling meeting, I hadn't even taken off my shoes yet when Michael stood in the kitchen holding up a wrinkled shirt, his voice sharp and cutting. "This shirt isn't even ironed. Do you ever do anything right?" I let out a hollow laugh, swallowing down the anger that burned inside me. There was a time when I was the woman running around, pitching to major clients, negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, commanding rooms with my presence and skill. Now, I was being asked if I even knew how to use an iron. I said nothing. Because the more I spoke, the more he twisted my words. Every attempt I made to explain, to defend myself, was met with blame and accusations. He tore into everything I tried so hard to preserve, my dignity, my hope, my very sense of self. I was starting to feel drained. Physically, my body was fine, but my spirit was worn thin, like a thread stretched beyond its breaking point. I remember once when I had the flu. Running a high fever, unable to get out of bed, I hoped for a bit of care. But Michael didn't even check on me. Instead of bringing me medicine or asking how I felt, he just stood by the door and said coldly, "Hurry up and get better. I don't have time to take care of you." I didn't expect much from him at that point. But those words, so blunt, so uncaring, sent a chill down my spine. That wasn't something a husband should say to his wife. That was something a stranger would say to someone they were forced to live with but didn't like. The loneliness became overwhelming. I felt utterly lost in my own life. When did the man who once held my hand at our wedding, promising to walk through life with me, become the one who hurt me the most? At that point, I started having restless nights, often waking up in the middle of the night, wondering why I was still here. Why was I, a strong, successful woman who had overcome so many obstacles, putting up with such a damaging relationship? I didn't tell anyone, not even my mother, Grace, who had always loved and protected me like I was her greatest treasure. She called many times to check in, but I always said everything was fine. I didn't want her to worry. I didn't want anyone to see my weakness. But I never expected Michael to drag my mother into this mess in the worst way possible. One Saturday afternoon, my mother came over, bringing my favorite stew and a basket of fresh fruit. I was chatting with her, feeling a rare moment of comfort, when Michael walked in. He took one look at her and sighed loudly, dropping his bag onto the floor. Again, there's always someone sitting around this house. My mother froze, startled, but she kept her smile and tried to stay polite. "I'm just dropping by to see my daughter for a bit. I'm not intruding." Michael shrugged and opened the fridge to grab a drink, speaking like I wasn't even there. "I don't want to have dinner with outsiders. Some people just don't know how to respect boundaries." I stood frozen. In that moment, I saw my mother hesitate. She gently set her bowl down, glanced at me, and softly said, "I think I should go. I'll come by another time." I walked her to the door, my heart sinking. When the door shut behind her, I turned to Michael, my voice no longer held back. "Do you realize how hurtful you're being?" He looked at me, unfazed. "I'm just being honest. If you can't handle that, that's your problem." I stood still in the quiet kitchen for a long time. The house no longer felt warm. Everything I had built, the life I had worked so hard to create, now felt like it was falling apart, piece by piece. At that moment, I had no idea that just a few weeks later, something major would happen. Something that would change everything. And in my most vulnerable moment, Michael would show his true colors more clearly than ever. I don't remember exactly when I collapsed, only that the office lights dimmed and everything faded to black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in a hospital bed in the emergency wing of the Mayo Clinic. An IV drip was hooked to my arm, and my head felt heavy, like I had just gone through a storm. The doctor told me I'd fainted due to prolonged exhaustion, and that they needed to run more tests because some of my readings were off. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I had always been strong, used to a fast-paced life, and figured a few days of rest would put me back on my feet. But 2 days later, I was moved to a private room to hear the real diagnosis. "We found a tumor in your pancreas," the doctor said, looking directly into my eyes. "Fortunately, we caught it early, but you'll need to start treatment immediately. This won't be easy." I heard his voice, but everything else felt muffled. The ground seemed to slip away beneath me. I wasn't afraid of the illness itself. I was terrified of facing it alone. That night, I sent Michael a brief text telling him I was in the hospital and needed to talk. He never replied. I called his phone. It rang once, then went straight to voicemail. Not a single message, not a word of concern, so I began treatment without him by my side. The infusions drained my body like a leaking faucet. My taste buds dulled, and my hair began to fall out in clumps. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a different woman. Frail, pale, but with eyes still burning with life. I kept fighting. Not just for myself, but because I knew there was still something I hadn't let go of. I couldn't let Michael walk out of my life that easily. He didn't deserve that. For 2 weeks, I fought alone in that sterile hospital room without a single family member visiting. I lied to my mother, telling her I was on a business trip so she wouldn't worry. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, Michael showed up. I thought I was dreaming. He stood at the hospital room door, hands stuffed in his pockets, eyes cold and unreadable. "You're here," I said softly, my voice cracked from exhaustion. He didn't answer right away. He stepped inside, placed a thick folder on the bedside table, and spoke like he was closing a business deal. "I filed for divorce," he said flatly. "The house and the car will be in my name. I think that's fair. As for you, I'm not even sure how long you'll be around." I stared at him, stunned. Something inside me shattered into 1,000 pieces, not because he was abandoning me, I'd expected that, but because of the sheer coldness in his words. He didn't come to check on me. He came to claim what he thought he was entitled to, as if I were some depreciating asset. I pressed my lips together, hiding every emotion. I refused to let him see me weak. I nodded and said quietly, "Pick whatever you want. Thank you for coming." Michael paused, maybe surprised by how easily I agreed. He shrugged, turned, and said one last thing on his way out. "Not like you have a choice anyway." When the door clicked shut behind him, I didn't cry. Instead, a cold, bitter smile tugged at my lips. I whispered to myself, "You just woke up the real me, Michael. And soon, you'll realize you made the biggest mistake of your life." I picked up the bedside phone and called the one person in my company I trusted, Eric, my chief financial officer. He had always been loyal, discreet, and the only person who truly understood the power I held behind the scenes. "Eric, I need your help with something," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. There was a brief silence, then he answered, "I've been waiting for this call. Just say the word." I nodded slightly even though he couldn't see me. I lay still in that white hospital room, watching soft sunlight filter through the curtains, feeling strangely at peace. Maybe because I'd finally decided to let Michael go, but not in the way he thought. He wanted to discard me at my weakest. Fine. But at that moment, I realized I wasn't the one who needed to be set free. It was him. From the life I'd carried on my back, a life he never even knew I built. 3 days after that cold hospital visit, Eric came to see me. No flowers, no sweets, just a sleek leather briefcase containing everything I needed. Eric set it on the table and asked gently, "Are you sure you want to go through with this plan?" I looked straight at him, my gaze steady and unwavering. "Yes, and I want everything to start tomorrow." Eric nodded, understanding exactly what was at stake. He was the only person in the company who knew I'd been using my mother's name as the legal representative to keep my identity hidden. I'd always wanted to live modestly, never letting Michael know I was the one behind the major contracts his company relied on. Looking back, maybe I'd been too kind. The next morning, I signed a brief letter terminating the supply agreement between my company, SilverMed, and Vital Technologies. where Michael worked in logistics. That contract accounted for over 65% of Vital's revenue last quarter, and I was the one who had approved it after Michael led the pitch nearly a year ago. I remembered clearly how excited he was, boasting that it was thanks to him the company had secured a deal with a major partner, never realizing that major partner was just one bedroom wall away. The termination letter was sent out promptly at 8 a.m. on Monday. By 3 p.m., I received a call from Vital's CEO, Mr. Peterson. The conversation was brief. "We're quite surprised by this," he said. "If possible, could you share the reason?" Calm but firm, I replied. "I've been made aware that one of your employees has exhibited inappropriate behavior, including disrespect toward female colleagues and misusing company assets. As a major partner, I cannot condone this." There was a pause. "May I ask the name of that employee?" "Michael Scott," I answered simply. That afternoon, Michael came home late, looking pale and defeated. He had no idea I'd hired a private attorney to file a counter-divorce petition, this time with a clause requiring him to vacate the house, which was solely under my name, within 30 days. That house, by the way, I had bought myself. I'd only added his name years ago to appease my prideful husband. Michael opened the fridge for some water, saying nothing. After a long silence, he finally spoke softly. "I got laid off." I set my book down, unsurprised. Due to the termination of that contract with my company, I walked slowly to the desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out an envelope. I placed it on the table and said, my voice calm to the point of coldness, "Because I'm the one who ended that contract. I'm the CEO of Silver Med, Michael. The company you thought you'd won over." Michael froze, eyes wide with disbelief. I continued, "For years I paid every bill, covered your credit card debt, paid tuition for your nephew when your cousin was struggling. I regularly transferred over $1,800 a month to you as an allowance, even though your actual salary was far less. I did it all because I believed in something called love." He stepped back, grabbed the envelope, and opened it with trembling hands. This can't be real," he muttered. I smiled faintly. "Divorce papers, asset division terms, and your meeting schedule with my attorney. You have 30 days to move out. And the $3,500 monthly mortgage payment? I won't be covering that anymore." He was stunned. The air thickened around us, broken only by the heavy breathing of the man who once leaned on me like the world belonged to him. I walked away, leaving him with the numbers and a brutal reality crashing down. In my heart, there was no hatred, only clarity. Michael had lived too long in the shadow I created. Now it was time for him to face what he had taken for granted. Just 3 days after Michael received the official divorce papers from my lawyer, the hospital room phone rang near midnight. I was exhausted from my second round of chemotherapy, but when I saw his name on the caller ID, I knew the panic had begun. "Emily, please. Just hear me out." His voice was shaky, raw, as if he'd been crying. I said nothing. On the other end was a man free-falling, and I, the one he had once left behind, was now the only lifeline he was desperately clinging to. I was wrong. So wrong I was stupid. I thought he saw me as just some dependent woman. But now I knew. I was the one holding everything together. I put the phone on speaker, leaned back against my pillow, and closed my eyes. Not because I was moved, but because I wanted to hear every desperate word. Something I had once wished for when I lay alone in that hospital bed, battling illness. Michael's voice rose with urgency. "I've lost everything. The house is about to be foreclosed because I can't make the payments. The company didn't just fire me, they put a formal warning in my file. No one else will hire me now. Emily, please, give me another chance." I opened my eyes, watching the soft glow of the nightlight. Calm and cold, I spoke. "A chance? You had a whole decade to respect me, to love, to share, to understand, and you chose not to. Now that everything you were used to is gone, now you realize my worth. Too late, Michael." I knew he was angry. But we were happy once, he pleaded. Please remember those times. I smiled faintly. Michael, do you remember the name Alyssa? The other end suddenly went silent. I could hear his breath catch. How? How did you find out? I spoke each word sharp as a blade. The CEO of Vitaltech called to apologize and mentioned they quietly investigated an internal complaint. Turns out you had a personal relationship with a new intern, Alyssa Morgan, 24 years old, daughter of the Chicago branch director. Should I go into detail about those late overtime nights? I asked. Michael stammered, No, it's not what you think. It wasn't like that. You're right. It was worse than I thought. I hung up without another word. Right after, I opened my contacts and hit block. I emailed my attorney requesting a no-contact clause during the divorce proceedings and began preparing a civil suit for breach of marital duty. In Minnesota, with proof of infidelity, the betrayed spouse can file for emotional damages, and I had plenty. The next morning, my lawyer, Eliza Harper, visited me in the hospital. She showed me a stack of screenshots from conversations between Michael and Alyssa. Flirtatious messages, hotel meetups, selfies taken inside the Vitaltech office, all time-stamped and geotagged. I wasn't shocked. I just felt relieved. Every suspicion I'd pushed aside now had a name. I sent a formal demand for $95,000 in damages. Eliza said he'd likely contest it, but with this evidence, the court would be on my side. I nodded, not because I needed the money, but because I needed my dignity placed where it belonged. A week later, I was discharged temporarily for at-home monitoring. During that time, Michael tried to contact me through emails, social media, and even showed up at my office. Not knowing security had been instructed not to let him anywhere near. Every attempt to win me back only confirmed one thing: Michael didn't love me. He just didn't know how to live without me. I started rewriting my financial plans, this time with no more husband's living expenses category. I also approved Eric to hand over the COO role to a new hire so I could step back, slow down, and finally enjoy some peace. And when I stood on the balcony of my new home, the one I moved into after leaving the old house full of memories and pain, I closed my eyes. I felt the cool breeze brush through the short new hair that had started growing back after treatment. I didn't need a man to feel worthy. I just needed myself. Strong, clear-headed, and never again willing to let anyone else define my life. Rumors of Michael's downfall spread like wildfire through the local business community. Vitaltech cut the contract, and his termination file quietly circulated among partner companies and industry contacts. Soon enough, Michael became the name everyone wanted to avoid. A logistics employee caught in scandal and facing legal consequences for breach of marital duty. With no home to return to, Michael moved in temporarily with an old friend in a cheap apartment complex in Brooklyn Park. A few weeks later, I heard he'd sold the car he once proudly called his symbol of freedom. Part of that money went to paying off credit card debts. The very same cards he had used so freely to buy gaming gear and lavish meals. No one wanted to hire a man with a stain on his record, and no practical skills to back him up. Eventually, he had to accept a night shift job at a delivery center, where the meager paycheck barely covered his monthly bills. Calls from collection agencies started piling up. His small apartment echoed with the ringing of late-night phones. Not calls from loved ones, but from creditors chasing unpaid debts. As for Alyssa, the young woman who once laughed with Michael after hours, she vanished from social media just days after the scandal broke. I didn't know what happened to her until Eliza, my lawyer, told me her family had privately settled part of the damages to avoid public litigation. Word had it, her parents took her back to their farm in Iowa and cut all ties with her former life. For them, that was the only way to salvage the family's reputation. As for me, my final treatment ended on a crisp autumn morning. When the doctor looked at me and said, "Your test results show you're completely clear," I didn't say a word. I just smiled and gently squeezed his hand. That was the moment I felt reborn. I returned to work after 2 months of rest. But this time, I wasn't the same Emily who'd tried to balance a demanding career with a failing marriage. Now, I was Emily on my own terms, focused, calm, and no longer weighed down by anyone who couldn't see my worth. The company welcomed me back with a simple but heartfelt team meeting. Everyone stood and applauded when I entered the main conference room. Eric smiled and handed me a mug that read, "Welcome back, boss." I'd once doubted whether I could start over. But in that moment, I knew. Not only had I come back, I'd come back stronger than ever. In the months that followed, I received more than a few date invitations. Some came from business partners, others from old friends who followed my story online. But I turned them all down. Not because I'd closed my heart forever, but because I knew I still needed time to heal. To enjoy a life no longer bound by responsibility to someone unworthy. I bought a small lakeside house in Duluth, where I could watch the sunrise each morning and listen to birdsong each evening. It wasn't grand. Not as luxurious as the old house, but it was my space. Peaceful. Whole. No one entered unless invited. One weekend afternoon, while brewing tea in the kitchen, Eric stopped by. We sat on the porch watching the lake shimmer under the golden sunset. "Have you thought about getting married again?" he asked, half teasing. I looked at him and smiled softly. "Not right now, maybe someday. But for now, I'm happy like this." He nodded, saying nothing more. The breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and in that moment I knew I hadn't just overcome Michael or the illness. I had overcome the fear that once kept me silent for far too long. I took a sip of hot tea, thinking quietly to myself. In the end, I became the one who wrote the final chapter of my story. From my journey, I've learned that resilience doesn't come from moments of strength, but from the times we rise after being pushed to our lowest. I once gave my heart to someone unworthy. Once sacrificed in silence without recognition. But now I live for myself, no longer trying to please anyone else. True happiness began the moment I chose to put my self-respect above everything else. What do you think of Emily's journey and her decisive choice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more powerful and heartfelt real-life stories about strength, courage, and self-discovery.